The morning air bites at the back of Seneca's neck as he steps ashore at Corsica, the salt sting sharp against his robes. The island is a wound in the sea, a jagged thing of black stone and pine, where the wind howls like a hound through hollow cliffs. His sandals sink into damp earth, each step echoing with the weight of a man who has walked the marble halls of Claudius's Rome and now trades their gold for the rust of a fisherman's hut. Around him, the natives move with a quiet urgency, their skin bronzed by sun and labor, their eyes scanning the stranger with a mix of curiosity and caution. A boy tugs at his cloak, pointing toward the cliffs where the sea foams against basalt, turning it white. "You look like the sky," the child murmurs, and Seneca laughs, a sound too measured, too civilized for the place. His quarters are a single chamber, its thatched roof groaning under the weight of rain. The scent of brine and oil from the boats mingles with the smoke of a peat fire, which crackles low in the corner. A bedroll lies on the floor, its linen thin, its wool coarse. He unrolls it with a practiced hand, though the gesture feels foreign here, among people who sleep huddled in the straw, their breath visible in the cold. A servant, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting across his brow, hands him a tunic of dyed linen, its edges frayed. "Wash," the man says, and Seneca nods, though the word is a command, not a request. The days blur into a rhythm of labor and observation. At dawn, he rises before the light, hauling nets with hands that ache from the cold. The sea gives little, fish slick and silver, their bellies hollow, their eyes clouded with the weight of the deep. He watches the men, their calloused fingers working the lines, their backs bent under the yoke of survival. A foreman, his face lined with years of salt and sun, barks orders in a dialect Seneca does not yet know. "Move faster, you lazy dog." The man turns, jaw tight, and Seneca sees the flicker of something in his eyes, a stubbornness, a quiet defiance. He wonders if the foreman's father once stood where he does now, his hands raw, his spine unyielding. At midday, the heat presses down like a lid, and Seneca sits on a weathered crate, peeling turnips with a knife. The task is monotonous, the turnips starchy and pale, their skins thick with grime. A woman approaches, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a basket of olives in her arms. She pauses, studying him, then set the basket aside. "You do not speak our tongue," she says, her voice softened by the heat. Seneca hesitates, then replies in Latin, his words careful, deliberate. She smiles, a thin, weary thing, and gestures to the basket. "You will learn," she says, and Seneca nods, though the promise feels hollow. By evening, the island falls silent, save for the crash of waves and the distant cry of gulls. Seneca lies on his mat, the fire dimmed to embers, and stares at the stars. They are brighter here, unfiltered by city lights, their light sharp and unyielding. He thinks of the man he was, Seneca the philosopher, the advisor, the man who wrote of virtue and the good life. Here, in this place of toil and quiet despair, he feels the weight of his own privilege, the ease of his former life. The cold seeps into his bones, but he does not shiver. He thinks of the foreman, the woman, the boy with the sky-like eyes. They have no virtue named, no grand titles, yet they endure. Their lives are not of marble or scrolls, but of grit and will. A storm brews on the horizon, the sky a bruise of gray and green. Seneca rises, his joints stiff, and walks to the cliff's edge. The sea roars, the wind clawing at his clothes. He feels the cold more now, not as a weakness, but as a test. The foreman had shouted earlier, his voice raw, about a broken net. Seneca remembers the man's face, the way his eyes had narrowed, not in anger, but in resolve. The storm, he realizes, is not an enemy. It is a mirror. And in that mirror, he sees not the man of Rome, but the man of Corsica, a man who faces the tempest, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of one who knows the sky will break, and the sea will rise, and he will stand. From the marble halls of the Palatine he stepped into the dust of Corsica, a provincial exile who had once held the purse strings of an empire. The same hand that signed edicts for Nero's treasury also copied, in cramped script, the meditations that would outlast the emperor's reign. Seneca's wealth was not a quiet inheritance, it was the fruit of loans to senators, of grain contracts that fed the legions, of a fortune measured in sestertii that could have bought a fleet. Yet the philosopher who warned against the tyranny of possessions lived in a villa whose gardens were watered by aqueducts he had helped finance. The contradiction is not a secret, it is the very texture of his life. He served as tutor, then as chief advisor, to a boy who would become the most capricious ruler Rome had known. In the Senate he argued for clemency, for the rule of law, for the dignity of the individual. In the palace he drafted the very decrees that tightened Nero's grip. Ancient sources record that he once wrote to Lucilius, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," while his own imagination was crowded with the specter of a tyrant's wrath. Tacitus records that when the accusations finally mounted, Seneca offered Nero his entire fortune in exchange for a quiet retirement, and the emperor refused it, a refusal that exposed how tightly precept and practice were chained to power. His exile to Corsica, ordered by Claudius on a charge of adultery with the emperor's niece, stripped him of office but not of mind. On that wind-blown island he wrote the Consolations, turning the loss of status into a laboratory for the very philosophy he preached. He learned to meet the sea's roar with the same equanimity he had once offered to the Senate's debates. When recalled, he returned not as a penitent but as a man who had measured the weight of power and found it wanting. The final act, forced suicide in a bathhouse, veins opened while his friends recited verses, is often rendered as a noble tableau. The records, however, note the haste, the trembling hands, the fact that he asked for a quicker poison when the first draft failed. Even in death the philosopher could not fully escape the body he had spent a lifetime trying to master. Seneca, then, is not a marble saint. He is a man who owned slaves, who lent money at interest, who whispered counsel to a tyrant, and who, in the quiet of his study, wrote that the wise man is content with himself. His contradictions are the proof that philosophy does not erase the world, it only teaches how to stand within it. The mirror he held up to Rome reflects a face both gilded and scarred, a reminder that the practice of virtue is not the absence of flaw, but the steady, unflinching acknowledgement of it. When the Senate's decree fell, it fell like a stone into a well, silent at first, then echoing through every corridor of the palace he had once commanded. Claudius, swayed by the whispered machinations of Messalina, sent the philosopher to the rocky shores of Corsica, a place where the wind carries salt and the hills hide no marble columns, only scrub and the occasional goat path. 8 years. 8 winters of damp stone and the thin, relentless light that filters through olive-gray clouds. In that exile Seneca lost the Senate's applause, the consul's lictors, the easy conversation of men who measured worth in gold and lineage. He gained, instead, the company of his own thoughts, unmediated by audience or expectation. He wrote, not for posterity but for survival. The Consolatio ad Helvium was addressed to his mother, a letter that reads like a man stitching a wound with thread spun from reason. He reminded her, and himself, that exile is not a punishment of the soul but a relocation of the body. The mind, if it chooses, remains a citizen of the cosmos. In the De Providentia he turned the gaze outward, asking why the gods allow the good to suffer, and answered with the Stoic conviction that adversity is the whetstone on which virtue is sharpened. The words were not polished for publication, they were hammered out on a slate of isolation, each sentence a test of the principle that the obstacle is the way. The island offered no library, no academy, no sympathetic ears. Yet the legend tells us that Seneca taught the local children the rudiments of Greek and Latin, turning a barren shore into a makeshift schoolroom. Whether that tale is exact or embroidered by later admirers, it captures the essence of his response. He refused to let circumstance dictate the scope of his duty. He tended the sick, tended his own ailing body, and tended the garden of his mind with the same disciplined care he once gave to the imperial treasury. When Agrippina's influence recalled him in 49 AD, the man who stepped onto the gangplank was not the same who had left. The exile had stripped away the ornament of office, leaving a core hardened by the knowledge that fortune is indifferent, but character is not. He returned to Rome not as a supplicant but as a practitioner who had lived the doctrine he taught, amor fati, the love of one's fate, not as a slogan but as a lived covenant with the inevitable. The 8 years on Corsica became the furnace in which the philosopher's steel was tempered, and the letters he sent across the sea remain the most durable testament that hardship, embraced, can become the very architecture of wisdom. The fire that forged Seneca on Corsica did not merely test his endurance, it revealed a principle that echoes through the marble halls of the later empire, spoken in the quiet chambers of an emperor who never sought the throne. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the dim light of a campaign tent, set down the thought that the obstacle itself is the path, that what stands in the way becomes the way. He did not claim the phrase as a slogan, he recorded it as a reminder to himself, a private counsel that the universe does not bend to desire, but that the mind can bend to the universe. In the Meditations he writes that the impediment to action advances action, and that the nature of the good is to act in accordance with reason, no matter the circumstance. This is the Stoic idea extracted from Seneca's Exile. Adversity is not a deviation from the good life, it is the very material from which the good life is built. The letters Seneca dispatched across the sea, urging friends to greet misfortune with a steady gaze, are the same counsel Marcus gave himself when the Danube froze and the plague stole his legions. Both men understood that amor fati, love of fate, is not a passive resignation but an active embrace, a deliberate turning of the will toward whatever the logos presents. When the world strips away comfort, the philosopher does not mourn the loss, he measures the remaining space and fills it with virtue. The principle, then, is simple in statement and infinite in practice: accept what happens, judge it rightly, and act wisely within it. Marcus never promised that the path would be easy, he promised only that it would be straight, because the straight line is the one that follows nature's own design. In the quiet after the storm, when the letters have been read and the campfires have died, the lesson remains: hardship, met with reason, becomes the architecture of wisdom, and the stone that once seemed an obstacle is revealed as the cornerstone. And yet the cornerstone does not merely bear weight, it invites the builder to shape the arch around it. In the winter of 41 AD Seneca stood on the rocky shore of Corsica, the sea wind tearing at the parchment of his exile, and he wrote to his grieving mother Helvia that the gods do not ask us to endure the storm, they ask us to welcome the rain that carves the channel. He had been stripped of office, of wealth, of the Senate's applause, and the emperor's favor had turned to suspicion. The story is told that when the centurion arrived with the order to return, Seneca did not kneel in relief. He lifted his eyes to the horizon and said that the same fate that had cast him out had also forged the philosopher who could now speak to the heart of power. This is amor fati, not a stoic grimace, but a quiet love that says, what has happened, would have chosen. In his letters he reminds us that the wise man does not merely suffer the blows of fortune, he adopts them as his own design, turning each reversal into a lesson that sharpens the blade of virtue. When Nero's court glittered with poison and intrigue, Seneca served as tutor, advisor, and, finally, as the man who could not escape the emperor's paranoia. The night he was commanded to open his veins, the accounts record that he dictated his final thoughts to a scribe, his voice steady, his mind already reconciled to the decree. He did not curse the blade, he thanked the moment for the clarity it supplied. The hinge of a strong life, then, is not the capacity to bear, but but the willingness to say yes to the very thing that would break a lesser soul. To love one's fate is to treat every loss, every insult, every illness as the raw marble from which the statue of character is chiseled. When the viewer tonight feels the weight of a sudden dismissal, a betrayal, a diagnosis, the practice is simple: name the event, acknowledge its reality, and ask, if this were the very thing I had chosen, how would I act? The answer, lived, becomes the architecture of a life that does not merely survive adversity, it is built from it. In the quiet of his study, Seneca wrote that the universe is one living body, each event a pulse within it. Resist the pulse and you fracture, embrace it and you become the rhythm. Rehearse the worst in imagination, he urged, so that when it arrives the soul greets an old acquaintance. Such rehearsal turns fate into a partner, not a tyrant. Marble yields only when the sculptor respects its grain, the necessity the Stoics call the logos. Tonight, carry this: the next obstacle is a doorway, and the key is gratitude. When the email arrives with a single line, "We have decided to move forward with another candidate," the room does not shake, yet the world contracts to the size of that sentence. Seneca knew this contraction. In 41 AD he was banished to Corsica, stripped of office, of friends, of the Senate's marble halls, and left to listen to the wind over a barren shore. He did not curse the sea. He wrote to his mother that exile is a teacher, that the mind can make a palace of a cave. The lesson is not that suffering is noble, but that the judgment we attach to it is the only thing we control. A diagnosis delivered in a sterile office, a phone call that ends a marriage, a contract torn up before the ink dries, each is a stone laid in the same quarry. The Stoic does not pretend the stone is soft, he learns the grain, respects the fisher, and works with the chisel he holds, his ascent. Amor fati, the love of fate, is not a bright slogan. It is the quiet decision to meet the moment without protest, to say, "This too is for me," and then to ask what the moment demands of virtue. Seneca, in his letters, reminds us that the wise man does not ask why the gods have sent this trial, he asks how he may act rightly within it. The modern setback is no different from the ancient one. The rejection letter is a summons to examine whether your worth was ever tied to another's approval. The loss is a summons to practice generosity toward the self that remains. The diagnosis is a summons to order the days that remain with purpose rather than panic. In each case the doorway stands, the lock turns, and the key is the willingness to turn it with gratitude, not gratitude for the pain, but gratitude for the chance to prove that the inner citadel cannot be breached. Tonight, when the next obstacle appears, remember the exile who wrote from a rock-bound island that the soul is free when it refuses to be a slave to circumstance. Let that memory be the chisel, let the present hardship be the marble. Shape it. And when the night deepens, carry the thought that every wound is a line in the ledger of character, that the Stoic ledger is balanced not by avoidance but by honest entry. The next morning you will rise, not because the storm has ceased, but because you have learned to read its wind. In the quiet after the decision, you may find that the very obstacle you feared becomes the measure of your freedom, a proof that the inner citadel stands unshaken, and that the chisel you wield is none other than the choice to say yes to what is. Tonight, let that yes be the final stroke that turns marble into meaning. When the house has settled and the last lamp flickers, sit with a single sheet of paper and a pen, letting the silence become the workshop where the chisel you have been shaping all day meets the marble of memory. Recall one moment, a delay that stretched the hour, a harsh word that landed like a stone, a plan undone by circumstance, that stirred resistance in you. Write it plainly, without ornament, as Seneca advised in his nightly review to Lucilius, a faithful record of what happened, not a judgment of what should have been. Then, beneath that line, write the acceptance in your own hand, "This occurred. I meet it." Speak the words aloud, feeling the weight of each syllable settle like dust on stone, and notice how the breath steadies when the mind stops fighting the inevitable. The practice is not to erase the event, but to claim it, to make the involuntary voluntary, turning the raw fact into a chosen stance. In the morning you will find the same sheet, the same words, and the same quiet certainty that the inner citadel has not been breached. This single act, repeated each evening, turns the abstract doctrine of amor fati into a habit of the hand and heart, and the night becomes a forge where adversity is tempered into freedom. Seneca, in his letters from Corsica, described how he would sit before the fire each night and rehearse the day's trials, not to lament them but to greet them as teachers. He wrote that the wise man prepares the soul for whatever fortune may bring, and that the rehearsal itself is a form of armor. By inscribing the day's resistance and then affirming it, you mimic that ancient drill, allowing the mind to rehearse acceptance before the next storm arrives. The ink becomes a quiet witness, the paper a ledger of consent, and the habit a bridge between the fleeting moment and the enduring virtue. Over weeks the ledger thickens, and the pattern of yes replaces the reflex of no, so that when a sudden loss or a public insult arrives, the response is already rehearsed, already owned. Tonight, let the pen be the chisel, the page the marble, and the single affirmation the final stroke that turns marble into meaning. When the ink dries, close the notebook and place it beside the bed, a silent promise that the day's hardest grain has been folded into the fabric of your character. In the hush before sleep, let the breath follow the rhythm of the written line, each inhale a recognition, each exhale a release. The Stoic does not seek to escape fate, he shapes it by the steady consent of his will. This nightly ritual, modest as a single line, accumulates into a life lived in accord with nature, where every obstacle becomes a stepping stone toward the inner citadel that no external storm can breach, and the morning finds you ready. Thus the nightly line you inscribe becomes a quiet pact with the inevitable, a reminder that the breath you draw now is borrowed from the same air that filled the lungs of Seneca as he stood before the emperor's tribunal, his voice steady though the sword waited in the shadows. He had known exile on a barren island, the sting of slander, the weight of a pupil who would become a tyrant, yet each reversal he met not with protest but with the acceptance that the universe does not negotiate. In his letters to Lucilius he wrote that the wise man loves his fate, not because the events are pleasant, but because they are the raw material from which virtue is forged. When the order came to open his veins, Tacitus records that he sprinkled water on the nearest of his servants, calling it a libation to Jupiter the Liberator, and spoke a few calm words to his friends as the blood flowed. That moment, set down in the annals, is not dramatized heroics but a testament to a philosophy that treats death as a natural return, not a tragedy to be avoided. In his own essay on the shortness of life he repeated the old physician's warning that life is short and art is long, a phrase he bent toward the Stoic conviction that the only true possession is the character we shape while we have time. Carry this thought into the dawn, the next sunrise will find you standing before the same choice, to resist the current or to flow with it, knowing that the current itself is the teacher. In chapters to come we will walk the marble halls of the Meditations, where Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, turned the empire's burdens into a laboratory for justice and self-command. Remember that the Stoic does not seek to escape the mortar of circumstance but to become the architect of his response, each breath a brick laid in the foundation of an inner citadel that no fire can melt. When the final hour arrives, and it will, as surely as the tide returns, the ledger of your days will show not the titles you held, but the moments you chose to meet fortune with equanimity, to love the fate that shaped you, and to whisper, as Seneca did, that the soul is free even when the body is bound. Let this truth settle in the marrow of your nights, and when the morning light finds you, carry it forward into the next trial. And if you walk this far with Seneca, walk next with Cato the Younger. The story of the man who chose death over dishonor already stands on this channel, and his unwavering resolve illuminates the path for those who would stand firm when the world demands compromise. May the marble of your resolve endure beyond the fleeting dust of empire and guide your steps forever.